Hello, adventurers.
Who are you?
What are you?
Where are you?
What's your mother's maiden name?
Who's that guy and how does he relate to you?
Who's that guy and why do you hate him?
You may not know the answers to all these questions, but you know what might help? A session zero. So sit down, relax, and join us for a short rest as we talk about session zeros in your game.
So first and foremost, what is a session zero?
Well, generally, it really varies a lot from table to table that I've seen, but generally you get together before everything is totally finalized. You might have ideas about characters. The DM probably has an idea of the campaign they're running, what to expect, and it's a time to sort of talk about that, get it all out there. DMs can talk about homebrew rules they have. Players can talk about expectations. You can talk about connecting your characters to the world, to other characters. And it's a really, really valuable time, I find, for building a cohesive party that also lines up with what the DM wants. It's really easy as dungeon masters to feel like we are very much at the whim of our party of players.
Or vice versa.
Yeah, or vice versa. Yeah, the players have to do what the DM has planned. And if that doesn't line up with what we want to do, how we have fun, then that can cause conflict. So it's really, really important to have that conversation ahead of time so that everybody knows what everybody expects at the table and you're all on the same page.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think the main goal of the session zero is so everyone has the same expectations going into the game. So if you're ready to run a game that's like super serious and intrigue heavy, you're not rolling up with a character that is more of a joke character.
Right, yeah, it's got like a big gimmick and, it just doesn't...
Exactly.
Yeah, so what do you like to have in a session zero?
Well, personally, like you said, there's a whole plethora of different session zeros depending on which table you're at. I've seen it go from you're creating the characters right there, and that's from start to finish. That's what you're doing. I don't typically like those.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you're coming to the table with an idea, as for a character, it can be really frustrating to other players who are maybe more familiar with the game and whatnot to sit through that.
I've had like a couple times where I've introduced new players to the game at the same time as experienced players are playing, and the experienced players can create a character in 15 to 30 minutes, and meanwhile, especially if you have a really indecisive new player, they can be there for hours, deciding what option is best, especially if they're playing something really modular, like a warlock or an artificer. That can take up a lot of time. And
it's not fair to that player either, because
exactly.
when they see that three experienced players are at the table with them, and they're sitting there twiddling their thumbs, waiting for the game to start, or not sure if they can leave because are we playing tonight? Then it puts them on the spotlight.
Right,
and
exactly.
You don't want to make anybody uncomfortable at your table at any point.
Mm-hmm. That's actually exactly the antithesis of what a session zero is for. A session zero should make everybody feel more comfortable at your table. It should make it feel like there's kind of a rapport. I find session zeros are most useful when you are running for people that you've never run for before, because you can tell what the expectations are. And for me, for example, like my big thing is that your character has to be a team player. It's a team game, and so I don't want lone wolves in my game, And if I make that establishment right out of the gate, then a new player who maybe wanted to play the like Aragorn or an edgelord rogue, they know that behavior isn't going to be facilitated by my game.
So, a question that is often asked is, what am I supposed to bring to a session zero?
Yeah, and a lot of that will be answered from DM to DM because everybody has their own process. My session zeros are very involved. I have a Google document that's literally bullet points of everything I want to cover so that I know I stay on track. But I think as a player, what you need to bring is your own expectations, have a clear idea of what you want from the game. You should at least have a strong character idea and maybe a backup. You want to be flexible, especially if you guys are going to be making characters at that session 0. You want to make sure that if someone else has an idea that kind of steps on your toes, that you're able to be the helpful one and be like, oh, don't worry about it. I've got another idea that's perfectly fine. I'm also happy playing this. And I think generally if everybody goes to a session 0 looking to help everyone else out, it's going to be a really beneficial experience to everyone. So as a player, when you're going to a session 0, what do you bring?
So I like particularly when session 0s have the expectation that you have already built a almost complete character. A lot of times I'll have the discussion with the DM prior to the session 0, and I'll be like, hey, this is what I'm thinking, this is the class, this is the race, this is kind of the vague idea of my backstory, and I'll develop that as much as I can depending on how much of the setting the DM has shared with me and how much I know about the other players. Sometimes that's the first time you're meeting the other players at the table. So you kind of you want to get ready to get to know the other players and their characters, and also be willing to be flexible. I think that's one of the most important things. If you come and you're like, well, I'm playing Norbit the Halfling Barbarian, and there's nothing that anyone can do to stop it, and I don't know anybody in the party, and all my whole family's dead. Like, if you have this completely fleshed out character that you have your own preconceived expectations about, then it might be hard to build that cohesive party that is so important to the game.
Yeah, and not to say that you shouldn't flesh out that character ahead of time, but if you get to the table and you guys are bouncing ideas off of each other, the DM is talking about how you can connect to this person over here. Like, maybe Norbit has a sibling, and if you're like, no, I want no familial relations, that's going to be harder for the DM to kind of get everybody together instead of yes-anding, it's like, yeah, sure, and that person is, you, Growlor, the halfling wizard, and, we're related, and this is how we create a sort of richer story together. I really find that session 0s really speak to the spirit of D&D, because ultimately it is a not just a game, but a collaborative storytelling device. We are telling stories when we play, so we should collaborate to make sure that all of our stories line up.
For you and your session 0s, do you like to play that night, or is it strictly a no-play day?
I think, so in my session 0s, I really prefer to have it be its own event. That way, if someone gets done really early, it isn't a bad thing if they're like, hey, I'm gonna go, I've got everything done. I generally don't like getting into it that day, because I also, when I'm doing session 0, I'm asking a lot of questions, and I want my players to kind of sit with those. I want the concepts that I'm talking about, the things I expect from my game, to be a team player, my, hierarchy when I'm making rulings, I want these things to kind of be slept on and kind of seep in before we get into it. If by, a miracle, this has never happened, but if by a miracle, everybody, gels immediately, and session 0 took, 10 minutes, I think it can be helpful to be ready to run something that night. But I definitely think it should be a separate night from your session 1.
Have you ever run into the situation where a player comes to a session 0 and they're really excited about playing the game with everybody, but they're disappointed that they don't get to play for a whole nother week? And what would your solution to that be?
I have had that happen. And I think the solution there, and something I think is really key, again, to D&D groups gelling, because that's really what a session 0 for, is to make sure everybody gels. You want a good vibe, is to be ready to play another game, So we might not be playing D&D tonight, but we've got our session 0, we're pumped for next week, and now we can play some Catan, we can play some Betrayal House on the Hill, something else that doesn't need to flex those RP muscles right away. You could kind of still have a good time with these people, and not have to worry about, like, oh, I haven't really decided, how Norbit feels about Growlor yet, and that's a discussion we need to have later,
Right.
Because, those big questions usually aren't things that can be solved in a night. You need to sleep on it, you need to think about it in the shower, you need to make the board with all the red lines connecting up, So, I really think that for my games, Session 0 the same night as Session 1 is a no-go. What are things that you do not like to see in a Session 0?
I think some of the no-goes for a Session 0 on the player side is inflexibility or their unwillingness to adapt playstyles. I think it's perfectly acceptable if the DM gives their opening spiel and they say, this is what I expect at my table, this is what the kind of story I want to tell, and if that doesn't work for you, then I think it's okay to say, hey, this game's not for me, rather than forcing your own play style on the rest of the party, on the rest of the players. From a DM, quite the same thing is an inflexibility. A lot of times players will come with ideas, and you want to do your best to use that yes and technique and facilitate their ideas to fit your world. And if it's like, oh, well, there's no such thing as an elf barbarian in my world, then I wouldn't say, like, no. I would say, okay, maybe we can create this subsection of traveling elven barbarian encampments, and we can make that work, rather than saying this is my setting and this is law. It's all about that collaborative storytelling, and if only one person's story is being told, whether it be the DM or the players, then I don't think everyone at the table is having as fun of a time.
Yeah. Kind of bouncing off of you. Some of the things that I don't like to see at a Session 0 on the DM side is a wishy-washy kind of attitude. You do want to be very flexible about, how things work in your game, but you do also want to be clear about how you feel in the moment. The idea of a Session 0, the whole point, is to clear up any confusion of intent that might happen at your table. It's to clear up that moment of like, oh, Ben didn't let me do this, so he must hate me. Like he didn't like that I did this thing, and so he's punishing me for it, as a person. Instead of thinking like, oh, Ben is here for me. He wants me to have a good time. He wants me to succeed. But in the world, as part of the storytelling, I faced this challenge by achieving this thing. But if you don't have that conversation, then, or if you're unclear about it, if you're like, oh, sometimes I'm on your guys' side, but, sometimes I'm not, if you get what I'm saying, that's not going to clear anything up for your players. And at that point, you're, just kind of, not really doing anything with the Session 0. Something that's important, too, is I think Session 0 should try to be as concise as possible, especially since you're not playing that night, theoretically.
Particularly if you have new players at the table.
Exactly, because, you don't want to burn people out of your game before it even starts.
Right.
And you do want to be respectful of people's time.
Yeah, and I find that D&D is very similar to a lot of board games. When someone's like reading all the rules to you, you're like, okay, I kind of get it, but I'm only getting like 10% of it, and I'm not sure how it all relates. So if you spend too much time in that scary area with new players, then it can be really daunting for them, because they're like, oh, I don't know how to play this game.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why you, especially with Session 0s, you should honestly try to vet new players before they even get to Session 0. Kind of like talk to them about all the options they have before that, so that when they get there, when they get to the table with everybody, they feel a little bit more confident, a little bit more safe, instead of being intimidated by the more experienced people at the table. I also think Session 0 is a really good time to bring up some of the more, I guess I'll say, like, dangerous character ideas, Like seeing how the party feels if one of the characters betrayed the party, or how the party feels about splitting the party. That can have, that is a very controversial thing.
Oh, yeah.
How your DM feels about alignment. That is a very big thing that can cause a lot of conflict between players and DMs, and something that's easily resolved in a session 0. If my DM decides that, because I'm chaotic good, I have to act this way, it's good to know that beforehand if I have the preconceived notion that my actions influence my alignment, not vice versa.
So we've been talking pretty vaguely about session zeros, and we've been alluding to the fact that each DM it's very different. So why don't we take a look at the way you conduct your session zeros?
Sure. So going down my list for the document I have here, I always start, if I have new players who I'm sure have heard of D&D, it's more popular now than it's ever been, but maybe doesn't quite know how it works. I do like to give just a super quick rundown, letting them know that it's a D20 system, letting them know what D20 system means,
Right.
letting them know that it's that group-oriented, like I mentioned earlier, role-playing game.
Particularly if they just casually have played board games, they might not be so used to the cooperative aspects that tabletop RPG could be. I mean, there's cooperative games like Pandemic, and whatnot, but they might not be super familiar with those rather than the more competitive games. So it's important to talk about that.
Exactly. I also really think it's important to build up your credibility as a DM as much as possible during this time. That is going to ensure you a lot of trust as a DM, which is very important. And so having a clear list of these are the things I expect, also this is how long I've been running, that will really help build up that credibility.
And it's helpful both ways, because I got into DMing far later than Ben did, and I was like, hey, this is my first time. I've been playing D&D for so many years as a player, and now this is my first time DMing. I'm going to make some mistakes, but just go along for the ride with me.
Yeah, exactly.
And then they don't get as nervous when those mistakes come up or whatnot. Or if you are a seasoned DM, they might be less likely to challenge your rules knowledge or something like that, hopefully.
Yeah. And then I also go over my hierarchy of rulings, which is a thing I've kind of come up with as I've been playing and running, which is anytime that I make a ruling, I base it off of fun, then fairness, then written rules, and realism. So if I'm running and a ruling question comes up, first I go off of what is the most fun, what tells the best story. Then I will go to what is most fair, if both options are equally fun. Then I'll look at the written rules, and then I'll look at realism. And that gives a very clear expectation of how I run my game, the expectations I have, and what my players can expect to be able to accomplish in my game.
As a player, hearing that at a session 0, I might ask, because it is a conversation, as a player hearing about the written rules being so low on that list, I might ask you, how does that affect your game? Is the rules out the window, or what would you say to make me feel more comfortable with it being, third on that list?
Right, yeah, so obviously, the rules are there for a reason. They're there to guide our storytelling. But what I try to instill with this is that that's what I see them as, a guideline. And if there is something that there isn't a ruling for, if there is something that I don't necessarily agree with, it just isn't quite as fun of an experience, it would bog down the experience, that I would rather go with my interpretation, and that I hope through the repertoire I've built that they can trust me as their DM to do what's best for the whole table.
Right.
That's a perfect segue into my next bullet point, though, which is issues, questions, comments, and concerns. I know I have felt very strongly about how my DMs take feedback, both what sort of the way I give the DM that feedback is, and also how they interpret it. So I like to clear up any air about how I like that to go. And personally, what I like, and this is different for every DM, I've had DMs who, after every session, they're like, all right, how did you guys feel about that? Give me notes. But for me personally, I like that to be a one-on-one conversation. One, just because that's more private for me. And it's also more private for my player. If they have a problem with another player, they can discuss it in safety. If they have a problem with something I'm doing, it isn't, in front of the whole group as like a big display. And if multiple people are coming to me about a ruling I made, then that tells me everything I need to know. That my party didn't like that ruling I made. That's something I can change for the future. Another thing I instilled during that is that I want to be very open about their feedback, and then I'm not going to argue with it. If you say something wasn't fun for you, I'm trusting the fact that that wasn't fun for you, and I can, move on from there, and we can try to reach something there. I think it's also important to talk about your game-specific themes. So this most recent one I made was for Tomb of Annihilation. So I very clearly list out that the themes are death and jungle exploration. Those are the big things that I want to focus on, things to expect, and that clears up any ambiguity about how likely am I to die in this setting? Well, death is one of my big themes, so you can expect that the characters you started with might not be the ones you end with when all is said and done.
And it's useful as a player to hear that because you'll know the kind of encounters and the storylines you'll be following, and you can help add that to your character backstory or base your backstory around it to help facilitate that story.
Mm-hmm. I also think that if you do have a bunch of players that are coming with not a lot as far as their backstories are concerned, that this is a good time to bring up the sort of backstory questions that you definitely want answered. One of my biggest ones is what is important enough to your character that they would travel into an unexplored and highly dangerous environment to find it? What is important enough for them to become an adventurer?
Because not everybody does that.
Exactly.
So why does your character do that?
Mm-hmm. And especially new players might not answer that question. They might, just assume that being an adventurer is a given and not even think about what is their character motivation to do that. And that's usually the point I end on, because that's when I get into the real nitty-gritty about what these characters care about and also what the players care about, because players are generally going to want to play things that they feel passionate about. If you are playing the greedy thief, you're not doing that generally because you don't like that kind of person. You're doing that because you want to role play that experience.
Sure. I noticed that your list kind of goes from more broad and vague topics, and it kind of narrows in right before you start that more conversational part of the session zero. Do you think that things like homebrew rules and your thoughts on alignment, those more specific game rulesy things, just come up naturally in conversation, and then you're like, hey, everybody, I'm talking about this now? Or do you touch base with every player? How do you handle those more specific nuances?
So generally, I'm very lucky because when I am running the game, I am usually either running for people that I have run for before and are very familiar with my rules, or I'm running for brand new players. I very rarely run for people who have been playing for a long time, just because of the area we're in. It's generally there's either you've played with me or you haven't played at all. And so for me, I have the luxury of not needing to talk about my homebrew rules necessarily, because for new players, that comes as part of learning the game. Mm-hmm. And then for my experienced players, they already know what's up. But definitely, I would say probably right after you're talking about your game themes, those higher topics, it's really good to get into the crunch of these are my homebrew rules, this is what I'm running with, and these are your options. So do you think it is absolutely necessary to have a session zero for your game?
I think there are very specific circumstances where a session zero might not be 100% necessary. But that includes a lot of the work that you do at the session zero to be done outside of the game table. An example of this is if you are part of a D&D group that plays together so often and you see those people regularly or are able to contact them regularly via the internet, and having a very strong communication about what they're bringing to the table. And I think even then, it's very important to sit down and have your expectations chat in person when everybody's there on the day of session one. And I would still generally give enough time in the beginning of the session to have some of that bookkeepy, housekeepy stuff. And you can go ahead and play session 1 that day, but you probably want to have, I would say, that 30 minutes to an hour in the beginning of the session to talk about some of the things that you might not have gotten over chat or text.
Yeah. Like, for example, with my newest campaign that I'm just about to start, considering the situation we're in, we can't really meet face-to-face, so a session 0 isn't necessarily possible. But I've been able to communicate with everybody one-on-one and give very clear ideas of where I think the game's going and where the players want the game to go as well. And so I've been able to do a lot of that bookwork so that when we are able to eventually meet in person to run this game, we'll have all the expectations, and the session 0, the little bit of time before the game actually starts, will be fairly short, especially since they're all people I've already run for.
Thank you all for watching. I hope that Ben and I have given you a better idea of what a session 0 is and how we like to run them.
Yeah, we hope that the advice and ideas that we've brought up today help you run your session 0s more smoothly and make sure that they're as helpful as they can be so that everybody's comfortable at your table. So, until next time, adventurers, we hope to see you on your next short rest.